I met Antonio initially as a client. Tony had contacted my office and asked us to represent him because he was having some problems with the federal government. We're very particular as to who we represent, but Tony's also very persistent. Tony actually took the time to fly out from Las Vegas to come and visit with us. I happened to have the time at that point to meet with him. Once I met with him, I decided he would be the type of person I wanted to work for. Tony is that type of person that really is amazing. As to where I see him in 3 years, that's really an interesting question because he's the type of person that could wind up being the mayor of Las Vegas in 3 years. Absolutely resilient, always able to come back from what amounts to very difficult circumstances. And my time with Tony has indicated to me he is that type of person that may be down one moment, but give him a little bit of time and he'll be back on top. I think the Tunnel Vision movie project is very interesting. It's based upon Tony's life, which to me is fascinating to say the least. He's been through more than most of us have been through and could go through in 10 lifetimes. If the Tunnel Vision movie project is resembling his life, I think it would be not only interesting but an exceptionally good movie. The money structuring law in this country is very complex. Most people don't realize it even exists. I've talked to judges and lawyers that were unaware. What the money structuring law is basically an opportunity for the federal government to attempt to control the flow of cash between individuals. If you attempt to pass $10,000 to purchase any item in cash, the individual receiving the money is required to file a form with the IRS. That form lists not only the amount of money paid in cash, but as well the denominations, the date, and essentially the parties involved. The purpose of that really was back in the early days involving the cocaine trade in South Florida. Because there was so much cash floating around, the government figured the best way to try to enforce the laws was to create new law that punished people for attempting to structure or avoid reporting under what we call the cash transaction reporting requirements. That requirement is really very simple. If you as a merchant or you as a business person receive $10,000 from an individual, you have to report that individual as having paid you $10,000 in cash or more. What's interesting about the law as well, you're not allowed to incrementally break it up. So in other words, you couldn't give someone $5,000 in cash one day, $5,000 in cash the next day, and avoid the reporting requirement. That's called a structuring transaction, which again is a federal felony. So the end result is anytime you're dealing in $10,000 or more in cash, you're required to report it. If you go to your bank and ask for a withdrawal in $10,000 or more in cash, they'll report it for you. In other words, they'll report you for having the cash. Congress recently recognized the absolute unfairness of forfeiture as it related to currency transaction reporting violations. Understand something, this currency could be completely legal, but what would make it illegal is failing to report a $10,000 or more transaction. It doesn't have to be drug money, it doesn't have to be mob money, racket money, prostitution money. It can be money that's perfectly legal but not reported as it should have been. Now if you take that money and go out and buy a car, that car now is subject to being forfeited because it was purchased with what the government terms illegal money. If you go out and you buy real property, that property can be forfeited. So the Congress, seeing the absolute unfairness as far as the application of this rule, has now come back in conjunction with the Department of Justice and created more of a forgiving policy. In other words, forfeiture does not necessarily accompany currency transaction reporting violations or every structuring violation. There is a difference between money laundering and what we call structuring. Money laundering would be if you take, for instance, cash that's been earned illegally through, say, a drug transaction. You have other businesses that you own that may or may not be profitable. So what you do with those other businesses is you take this illegal money and you funnel it to those other businesses, claiming it is income derived by way of those other businesses doing a specific job. Because of that, you're in a situation where you now are laundering dirty money through legitimate business enterprise. If you're structuring, that's a little bit of a different problem. Structuring would be taking, for instance, $10,000 in currency. You want to purchase something that costs $10,500, but you don't want the merchant to report it. So you structure a deal where you give the merchant $5,000 one day, then maybe later that day you come in and you give them $5,500. Now you're structuring a transaction to avoid what we call the currency transaction reporting requirement. If you remember, $10,000 or more must be reported. If you are breaking that up to avoid the reporting requirement, you're essentially structuring a money laundering transaction potentially, or you're simply structuring a transaction to get around the requirement that you report the $10,000 currency transaction.
Hi, my name's Derek Collada. I live in Las Vegas, well, actually Henderson, Nevada. I'm a CPA in California. I'm also an enrolled agent. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, went in the Army for 4 or 5 years, got out of that, went back, got a business degree. After that, went and worked for the IRS for 6 years, passed the CPA exam, left the IRS, went and worked for various CPA firms, and I've been on my own as a individual tax preparer for about 10, 12 years in Henderson, Nevada. And that's about it. How did I meet Tony? I don't recall 100%. It was about 3 years ago. I think a colleague or someone who I know knew him, knew he was having some issues, referred him to me, sat down. Tony and I have worked through his problems over 3 years and gone through everything, and that's pretty much it. Where do I see Tony in 3 years? I think he'll be fairly successful if he gets the proper advice. He got bad advice last time from people telling him to do stuff. Tony didn't know he was doing anything wrong, but he took the advice of lawyers and accountants who led him astray and ended up in some trouble. But I think in 3 years he's going to be fairly successful. He's a very hard worker, very focused, and he should be okay in 3 years. What do I think of the Tunnel Vision film project? I've read part of the script, talked with Tony about it. I actually like it very much. I think it'll play well on a movie screen. I think it's going to get some backlash from the government because you're going to show how far-reaching and unfair the government can be to individuals when they think they've done something and they can't prove it, and then they have to cover their tracks and move it. But I think it'll play a really good movie, and it should be successful. I've been asked to explain the civil forfeiture rules and how those work, and pretty much the civil forfeiture rules, you're starting to see more about it in the news because the government, law enforcement agencies are really overreaching their bounds. Congress is even starting to look at it because people who have done nothing are being seized just because they deal in cash. Last time I checked, there's nothing illegal about having cash in this country or carrying cash. But you get pulled over by a police officer, you have cash, he asks you where it come from, you could say I pulled it out of my bank account for college funds. He can take it and say I think it's drug money. Then it can be years before you can do it. It's perfectly legal for them to do it. There's been some recent cases where Congress has even encouraged the IRS to refund money they have seized, and they have done it. What do they need for it to do it? Pretty much anything that they want. I really think police officers and law enforcement officers are being encouraged to do civil forfeiture because it's a way of funding their operations. A police department seizes money, it goes into their general fund or a group of police general fund, and they can do whatever they want with it. You know, there's been situations where they bought, you know, ice cream machines for the police station using those monies. Is it fair? No. Do they do it? Yes. Is there anything we can do to stop it? No. Unless Congress changes the law. There's something going on right now where it's going through Congress where it's a fair act, something like that, and it's really, really bizarre how the government does this. You know, they can seize your money. In order to get it back, you have to hire an attorney. Even if you can show you got the money from a lawful source, let's just say you took it out of your IRA, you know, cash it out, and you're going down to Phoenix to pay for your mom's nursing home and you get stopped on the way there, they'll ask if you have cash. You say, yeah, I have some cash. They'll take it and say it's drug money. Then they'll just hold on to it, and you can come back and say, look, I pulled it out of my IRA account. Here's the email. I'm going down to pay for my mom's, and they'll just keep it, and they'll say, no, we think it's drug money. Then you got a lawyer up, and unfortunately it costs more to hire a lawyer than it is the amount of cash they seize sometimes. So I think they rely on that fact that people will just give up. That's about it. Is it fair? No. Go ahead and Google civil forfeiture. There's some really interesting videos on it. And until people start complaining to their Congress people, nothing's going to change. There has been some cases recently where the judges have ordered the departments to give the money back plus legal fees, so that stings them a little bit. But you better have clear and convincing evidence that the money came from a clear source. And it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years. Okay, I've been asked to say what structuring is, and structuring came in 1980s. It was part of Reagan, the war on drugs, and pretty much it's what people know as the CTR report, which stands for Cash Transaction Report. So if you go to the bank and have $15,000 of cash and deposit it, the bank's going to generate a CTR, which is reported to the IRS. Is there anything wrong with that? No. Is it illegal to deposit cash? No. What is illegal is if you go to the casino, you win $30,000 of cash, and then over a period of 3, 4, 5 days, you deposit $9,000 one day, $8,000 the other day, $7,000 one day, and then a week later deposit $3,000, $4,000. That's what's called structuring. And structuring is when you arrange the deposits in your bank account or arrange your affairs to avoid that CTR report. And that has some pretty good teeth on it. You can go to jail for up to a year for each account and a $250,000 fine for each account. And unfortunately, there are bankers out there and attorneys who will tell you to do it, not knowing the repercussions. You walk into, I'm not saying anyone I know has done this, but you can walk into a bank with $12,000 of cash, and the banker will say, well, only deposit 9 today and deposit 3 tomorrow. That's structuring. So, you know, people need to know about that. If you're guilty of structuring, or they think you are, that opens up a whole can of worms. They'll go into money laundering, wire fraud, mail fraud. They'll just chip away, and you know, if you're guilty of a structuring charge, you could end up facing 30, 40 charges, and they'll hope you plead guilty to the structuring charge just to be done with the case.
He was referred to me by a gentleman that I knew from a number of years back when I was litigating a double jeopardy issue involving criminal prosecution and forfeiture back in the early 90s. He happened to well, Tony was looking for an attorney for a second opinion on the forfeiture, and this gentleman, you know, referred him to me, and that's how he came to me. Starting over, you know. You know, I don't know what's going to happen to him at sentencing. My understanding is he's looking at 36 months. Typically when individuals get out, I mean, you know, he'll be on supervised release, so the federal government will be keeping tabs on him. I don't, I mean, I don't know what he's going to do. I mean, I would imagine he'll just start his business over again and conduct it in a little different manner. I've talked to him numerous times about listening to people's advice and maybe getting a second opinion when he's not sure, rather than just using his own you know, lack of knowledge and making uninformed decisions, which is what happened to him. Structuring laws are kind of a interesting body of law. It was never contemplated to be used in the manner that they've used it. He had some pretty poor advice. I can't imagine any lawyer telling somebody to make deposits in less than $10,000. I mean, there's no reason, you know, when the money is from a legitimate source, and just going and depositing, you know, 80,000 or 100,000 or whatever it might be, and filling out the report. You draw much more suspicion on yourself when you make small deposits. And you know, lately there's been a number of investigations, and not so much prosecutions, but certainly seizures of money from even stores that, you know, they might take in $8,000 a day, and they'll make a deposit, and then, you know, a couple of days later they'll make another $8,000 deposit, and the next thing they know, their bank accounts are frozen. The government tries to take their money for violation of you know, anti-structuring laws, and it's all done innocently. There's certainly no criminality, and that's not what those laws were designed to prevent. It's just unfortunate, you know, that you know, they pursue that. Although my understanding is that the policies are changing. It's not helping anybody like Tony. I've had other cases where I was able to resolve structuring cases with a compromise on the amount of money forfeited, and you know, the government declined to prosecute any, you know, as far as a crime. Certainly they took money, but there was no criminal prosecution involved. I haven't had any time to really look at it. I mean, you know, he has an interesting story. He's an interesting guy. He's an imposing individual. I mean, he's certainly you know, he's not a small man. He can be somewhat intimidating. He's definitely a stubborn guy. But his story is interesting. I mean, I think it's retaliation on the part of, you know, the local government. They weren't able to do anything to him. You know, he's not involved in drugs. He was, you know, he was a music producer essentially, and they didn't like the type of music that he was producing. Their investigations went nowhere, and so the next thing you knew, the federal government was investigating his, you know, banking transactions, and you know, they weren't able to find any other criminal wrongdoing. The only thing he's really been charged with is making deposits, numerous deposits in an amount less than $10,000. Structuring laws were initially designed as a tool to help law enforcement curb money laundering by drug dealers and mobsters and things like that. Later on, they were used to seize essentially innocent people's money who mistakenly deposited less than $10,000 and did it over a period of time. the law itself imposes a requirement on the banks to file a currency transaction report whenever anybody makes a deposit of cash or withdrawal of cash in excess of in excess of $10,000. When someone makes a series of deposits that are less than $10,000, that's where there's a triggering that happens. Typically, it's the bank will fill out a suspicious transaction report or somehow inform the government that this individual is depositing large amounts of cash over a period of days or in separate branches. It's a funny law because it doesn't really require, at least on the part of the government, they don't feel that it requires an intent to defraud the government out of anything. I mean, all it's required really is if you go to make a deposit of $10,000 and you deposit $9,900 one day, and the next day you go in and deposit another $500. That's structuring. The law itself is structuring a cash transaction to avoid the reporting requirement. When you do that, a bank will take $5,000 from you. They don't have to fill out the currency transaction report. Frankly, I've seen situations like Tony's and where the bank officers themselves will say, why don't you break this deposit into separate deposits? And it's not like it's any trouble for the banker or the teller to fill out a currency transaction report. I mean, so many banks, it's just an electronic, we got this guy's social security number, we took in this amount of cash, period, that's it, end of story. It's a funny law, and it's causing a lot of harm these days to a number of innocent business owners.
I met Tony Servideo about 4 years ago. He was introduced to me by a colleague of mine in my former law firm. He came to us with a real estate problem, and we were able to assist him with that and resolve it. I expect Tony to continue to flourish in the future in the entertainment industry. Since I've known him, he has really been a resilient and resourceful character. And I know his passion is in that industry, and so I just wouldn't be surprised that we will hear more about him in doing projects much like the one we're talking about today. I think Tunnel Vision is going to be a very exciting movie for people to see. It's a very interesting, somewhat of a biopic of what's happened to Tony and his life, and I really think that with the different characters involved, whether they're in the entertainment industry, in the legal industry, the government, the casino industry, etc., that it's got all the makings of becoming a very, very exciting movie to go see. Money structuring, that's a real interesting crime, so to speak. To tell you quite honestly, I don't know much about it. I've been a business lawyer for over 20 years, and when I actually first heard of money structuring, I really didn't know what the hell it was. I had to look it up, and when I did, and when I read it, I really didn't understand it. I didn't understand why it was a crime, who the victim really was with the crime, and even today, I still don't get it. I think it's stupid, and interestingly enough, I'm reading more and more how the law is under attack by various people who've fallen into its web as well as now government officials are questioning whether it is a legitimate crime to go after people about.